Hi everyone, welcome to the Stars and Startups podcast with me, Varun Gumbi. Today I welcome our guest, Alok Mittal, who you can say has become a fixture in the Indian startup ecosystem. Alok is currently the co-founder and CEO of IndieFi, a debt financing platform for the Indian SME. He's also an angel investor and the founding board member of the Indian Angel Network that he had helped set up in 2005 after his startup Jobs Ahead was acquired by Monster.com. Alok went on to become a venture capitalist, lead the India operations for Canaan Partners. If you want to stay informed about future episodes, listen to some amazing entrepreneurs just like Alok Mittal. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to this or on YouTube. You can also stay informed by subscribing to our Substack at stars.substack.com, where you will get intimated every time we release a new episode. Okay, let's say hi to Alok Mittal. Welcome to the show, Alok.
Thanks, Varun. And we will talk about the fixture comment of yours. But I, but thank you for having me over. Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, Alok, this is a very interesting time for startups in general and what's happening in the ecosystem. And you're probably, you have your ear close to the ground. But before I get to what's happening today, I need to ask you, in 99, when you started Jobs Ahead, a lot of Indian startups actually started with a jobs portal at that time. Was it the original internet gold rush in India?
It was, right? So 99 was the dot com boom days. And in fact, the dot com boom had already been taking effect in US for a couple of years before that. I had been looking at starting a business for a couple of years before that, right? And in the mid 90s, the only business as a techie you could do was software exports. So I did try my hand at that. And then, Puneet and I got together and we said, this is the whole internet rush happening and we need to do something about it. So initially, we actually did not start with the notion of building a job board, right? There were, I think, less than 2 million internet users of any sort. This included the dial-up plans and everything. And we said, all of these are people between 18 to 35. So let's build everything that 18 to 35-year-olds are going to need. So we had a business called Zip Ahead, which
Okay.
had jobs in it. It had dating. Tinder back in '99. It had fashion, and it had e-commerce. We were selling books online. So we launched that in November of 1999.
Okay.
And in the first 45 days, it was clear that 80% of our traffic was going to jobs,
Mm.
right? So the consumers voted with their clicks that jobs is what they cared about, and rest everything was optional. And so within 2 months, March 2000, then we launched Jobs Ahead as a separate brand, saying this is where we're going to. It took us a while to give up the rest of just Zip Ahead, but the focus on Jobs Ahead came in very, very quickly.
So Zipahead was a classifieds at that time?
No, it was a full stack. So jobs meant that we were doing jobs with the classified and the database piece. We were doing books end to end. So we were sourcing books, we were shipping books,
Mm.
right? Dating and fashion was largely content, at that point in time.
Okay.
We did not have a lot of services to back that up.
Were people just coming online to find work? Because I'm guessing there were no, I'm sure there were headhunters, right? Why was internet enabling this? Because I
Yeah.
think
So
Naukri also started around the same time.
no. Naukri actually had existed 3 years before we started.
Okay.
So Naukri was founded in '96, if my memory serves me right. So there was already Naukri brand was well established. They had not started to monetize or think of it that like a real business. So it was a bulletin board, but there was evidence of traction. Where we drew most of our inspiration from, though, were the U.S. markets.
Mm.
And Monster was already large in US. It was a publicly listed company, and we could see the relevance of that service to the Indian market. Right, newspaper classifieds were already big. So in US also a lot of transition to online jobs happened from newspaper classified. In fact, Monster was bought by TMP Worldwide, which was the largest job classified company in the country. And so we could see that migration happening. That was the reason to pick jobs. But we picked jobs as one of the categories, and then users told us that that was the only thing they wanted.
So you double down on jobs because majority of the traffic is going there, and if
Right, right. That was
if
probably the fastest pivot in startup history, right? It was November we launched Zip Ahead, and by March we had already launched jobs.
I would imagine at that time there were also very few websites that people could go to and find good information. Were you creating content, or was it content being created by users at that
No, so we were creating content. The mechanism of user participation was discussion boards,
time?
right? So bulletin boards. So we had that enabled. So architecturally, we wanted to do content, community, and transactions. Now, in a service like jobs, it was largely transactions.
Right.
In a service like fashion, it was content and community. Right. The idea was, if this is the only audience and there are so few of those people around, then give them everything that they need. So there was this whole notion of audience focused verticals. They were called voters, vertical portals. iVillage was an example for women in US. So he said, if women is my audience, I'll give them everything. So we said in India, youth is the only audience, so let's give them everything. And then they came back and said, no, we don't want everything, we just want jobs, right? So
When you started Jobs Ahead, you were still working at Addison,
no,
or were you had quit and you were like, okay, I'm gonna
yeah, I had
start
quit.
something.
So yeah, I had quit. So um, I think Puneet and I met in, I want to say late March, early April,
Okay.
and I used to be based in Bangalore at that point in time. And literally, we chatted over a night out, one night. Right, Puneet was visiting from Delhi, and over the course of that night, we decided that we are going to do an internet business. We didn't know
Hmm.
what, right? So the ideas were still open. And then it took me about a couple of weeks to go in and tender my resignation, move Lost Stock Barrel here. We started out in May, and then we spent about a month trying to figure out, what really we wanted to do within the internet space. So I had a clean break from Harrison. Those guys were super supportive. My super boss, called me, told me if you fail, don't worry, you can come back, we'll take you. And for a 27-year-old with no family money,
Hmm.
that was a big reassurance.
Addison was huge, right? At that time, I think they also got acquired a couple of years after that.
No, actually, so those things happened quite a bit later. My sense is Addison might have been still under 1,000 people at that point
Okay.
in time. And then they went public after a couple of years,
Hmm.
and then they got acquired later. So yeah, Addison was still fairly small, and I had joined Addison way back in '96. I think at that point we were 200, 250 people. So
Okay.
that was part of the reason why my super boss could know that there was this insect flying around called Alok who wanted to do a startup, and I've never forgotten that. Right, he was a great mentor.
I think a lot of other entrepreneurs also came out of Addison. Um,
Yeah,
I think globally, I think they, because they went public very quickly, also made a lot of few millionaires. They gave them
yeah.
kind of bank accounts to go and do other things. Um,
That, and I think the culture was such that people got a lot of. It was a small company
hmm.
when we started out, so people got a lot of freedom. I was, the reason I went to Bangalore is my boss was setting up a new uh, office for what was Hughes Software System at that time, not Harrison.
Right.
And so he said, "Ah, look, I want you to come with me." I was like, "Sure." And we started creating new products there. Right. The idea of the Bangalore setup was that we will do stuff that is not happening here, and create products for the company. Most of the work in Gurgaon at that time was services.
Hmm.
And so within that team that started out, pretty much the first 15 employees at Hughes Gurgaon, I think at least 6 or 7 have started their own companies.
And is that primarily because of mindset, or because they gave you opportunities and the ability to lead, and create, uh, the mindset?
Yeah, I think it was largely the mindset, and I think things happen for a reason, right? While we may attribute a lot of our moves to ourselves, the reason. So let me tell you another statistic. My IIT computer science batch had 38 students,
Hmm.
right? More than 20 of us had started our companies by 2002, within 8 years of graduating.
The whole batch.
22 out of 38,
Wow.
22 students out of 38 had started
That,
their own company within 8 years of graduating, right? Now, what was the reason, right? Because we graduated in 94. When
hmm.
99 hit us, right, we had not built liabilities yet, right? We were 27 years old, right? Risk appetite was high. We were still hands on, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
If you go two batches before, same IIT,
Yeah.
you will see hardly any entrepreneurs in that time period. If you go two batches later, you will see hardly any, right? So I think the similar thing happened with the Aricent setup at that point in time, where all of us got the confidence to build, right? All of us got exposed to these things that were happening globally, not having to focus just on doing the services business. We had a great leader there, Madhu,
Hmm.
right? He was like, yeah, if you want to do a startup, go out and do a startup, right? So I think a lot of those things were common factors in what might have led us to become entrepreneurs.
Was Jobs Ahead bootstrapped until you exited?
No, 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 no. So JobsNet was actually we had angel funding as soon as we started.
Hmm.
So Puneet's family and some of my friends pitched in, and then we raised what at that time looked like two rounds of financing, but in all about $3.5 million in the company uh, to get it to where it landed. So it was not bootstrap, and I think at that time that money felt like a lot of money. So our first marketing campaign was, uh, I think, what would have been 3 crores or something at that point in time, but the whole country knew that there is something called job fair. One of our sales managers, and we were poor communicators, one of our sales managers called from Bangalore because we were still zip ahead at that time, and he said, "Boss, एक नया कंपटीशन आया जॉब जेड करके." मैंने कहा कंपटीशन ही अपना ही है. So so people noticed that ad campaign, which was 3 crores,
Right.
right? So I think we raised a fair bit of capital in the context of those days.
When you started out, did you have the intent of raising money, or you felt like, because I would imagine at that point you would have had to spend for servers, you don't have an AWS, you have a lot of infrastructural costs, and you
Yeah,
being the tech guy, you probably already mapped out all expenses that need to go towards, building infra.
yeah. So actually, we always had the intent to raise money, and I think a lot of that was because what was inspiring us was the already what looked like billion-dollar companies in the US, right?
Okay.
And so we knew that we will need money for sales, marketing. I don't think technology spends was that big a mover because remember it's 2 million people on internet all over the country, right? So the issues of scale that you face today, where you say, I'm launching Mitro and it's suddenly 40 million users in 3 weeks, we didn't have to face that problem, to be honest, right? So it wasn't technology that was driving us to raise capital, but more the sales and marketing uh, spends.
When you reach the end of your time at Monster, after the sale, actually tell us, how did the sale happen? Because most entrepreneurs want to run their businesses, right? They don't want to sell
Yeah,
out,
yeah,
especially
yeah,
when you're early in the internet and you get the opportunity to go extremely wide. You could
yeah, yeah,
diversify into many different businesses, there are different
yeah,
business
yeah, yeah,
lines.
yeah. So I think that the 2000 to 2004 was a very topsy-turvy time, right? So once the dot-com bust hit us, there was no capital available, right?
Hmm.
Zero. And all of 2000, we went through all of 2001. Sorry, we went through multiple rounds of headcount cuts and so on, where we essentially had to bring down our cost in line to get to a break-even situation because we were running out of capital. So we got to that point about end of 2001, and then for the next 2 3 years we built the business. Then pretty much in a bootstrapped manner, but growing very rapidly, 3 to 4x every year, right? Albeit on a small base. Uh, So when the offer to acquire JobsAhead came in, and Monster had been in the market for 3 years, right?
Mm.
Between Naukri and JobsAhead, they realized that an acquisition will take them significantly further, right? As far as we were concerned, external capital was not available at that point in time.
Right.
And so I think the notion that how fast is the market growing, what are the resources available, this looked like a good exit option for us. In hindsight, it looks like a terrible decision, but hindsight is 2020. Uh, I have, though, never regretted that decision because, in some sense and form, one story gives way to many more stories, right? And so, I think JobsAhead, for me personally, did pave the way for possibilities that did not exist for me
Mm.
before I did that.
So the time you left uh, Monster at that point, you became an investor, a venture capitalist. I know a lot of successful entrepreneurs become venture capitalists today, but you were quite young at that time, and you probably had interest to build other companies or take a break, do other things. Why do
Yeah,
you
yeah.
choose to
So
be?
no, no, I did not. I did not. This was all very accidental. When we exited Jobs Ahead, we threw a party, right? We invited our supporters and so on. And two of the people who happened to be at that party were Ashish Dhawan, who was my investor at Jobs Ahead, and Saurabh Srivastava, right? And we were chatting. And again, this is late 2004. Okay. There wasn't any VC active in India apart from the government-owned VC fund. And we got talking about the fact that entrepreneurs are not getting any capital,
Mm.
right? And hence we should. Uh, I think someone did mention you should start a fund. I was like, no way. Now, I didn't know anything about funds, right? I'm a techie at that point. But the idea I threw back was there was this organization called Band of Angels in the US, which was a group of angel investors. So we said, why don't we just form a group of angel investors so that at least at a very early stage we can start to support on, right? Saurabh, Ashish, they loved the idea. We got a few friends together. February 2005, we started this thing called Indian Angel Network,
Okay.
right? So that happened pretty much as a side activity. While I was operating it for the first year, operating it was not a full-time gig, right? We
Mm.
got in 10, 15 of our friends into as angel investors. We identified our first deal, No Cross, in November of 2005. Nikhil Nath was our first entrepreneur. And I was very much in the pursuit to February 2005 is also when I came out of Monster. I was looking for my next business idea. September must have been 13th, 2005. I landed up meeting Rahul Bhasin, who was an acquaintance and was running Bearings Private Equity. So I went to meet him generally, right, walking him through ideas that I was running and so on. They were not even in the venture business.
Mm.
So he said, look, while you are looking at your next startup, why don't you come help us build our venture practice? So I said, okay, 15 September, Monday, I joined him to build Bearings venture business. So that was my planning for getting into the venture business.
Okay.
As things turned out, the Bearings venture practice did not work out. Kanan reached out to set up India office. I joined Kanan in March of 2006. So getting into venture capital was not a plan. Getting into investing was not a plan. I was very much looking at doing my next startup. But it happened and then it stuck. So when I joined Kanan, I told Deepak, who recruited me there, that I'm here only for a couple of years because I want to do my next startup. And Deepak just smiled and said, "We will see, we'll see." Right? And that ended up being a 9-10 year stint at Kanan.
Yeah, a decade later, you didn't know what sucked you in.
So that was always the
Um,
plan. What I did a decade later was always the plan. So don't ask me why I left venture and became an entrepreneur.
okay, now that question goes out because we know exactly what happened over there because it probably just marinated in the back of your brain, saying, "I need to get out of here at some point." Um,
At some point, yes.
and, how was your time at Canon? I know that they made a few interesting bets in those days.
Yeah.
Any interesting stories?
No, I think I had a great time at Canon, right? So the fact that I joined firm which had a lot of pedigree in the US, a lot of senior partners, meant that there was a lot to learn, right? So from an investing standpoint, very solid set of folks. Uh, Canon itself had reinvented itself in the 2000 to 2005 time frame from a LP based standpoint.
Hmm.
So it had vintage, but it was very very agile. It was one of the first venture capital funds to decide to set up an office in India.
Okay.
So I had a great time. I had a great time investing, just partnering with entrepreneurs, listening to all the new ideas, uh, you know, selling to entrepreneurs. I somewhere through the jobs and journey, I figured out that I'm a sales guy at heart, and so I enjoyed that process. So I think that was a lot of fun. I think towards the what was my fag end of that journey, I started to feel itchy about doing a startup again. Canon, from the India business standpoint, was going through a transition at that point in time. So there was a natural opportunity to take that decision.
What I've read is that Canon basically sold their assets to a asset management fund so that they can exit the
Yeah.
India business.
So what Canon, wanted to do was to, when we started out, there was a global fund which was investing in US, Israel, and India. In 2013, for example, we decided that we did not want to have the Israel business under the global fund. And the partner there decided that he wanted to then raise a separate Canon Israel fund, and we supported that. Right. So 2014, we did the same thing with India. We want to focus the global fund as a US fund, right? And then I had to make kind of decision whether I want to raise a fund or do something else.
Right.
Once I decided that I wanted to do a startup, I actually went back to the partnership and said, so the normal course in this would be I continue to run the portfolio for Canon in India, right? Because you want to make sure those companies see their natural outcomes. But since I was doing a startup, went back to the partnership. I said, the best thing for me and for you is that we find a buyer. And it so happened that JP Morgan, where we sold the portfolio, was already a limited partner in the Canon funds, right? So it was not like a open-ended marketing exercise. We said, why don't we check with some of our LPs who have a secondary business, and we were able to consummate a sale of the portfolio within that. So I think that was a great decision for everyone, right? Canon did not have to worry about what is Alok doing. Alok did not have to worry about, I still got to allocate 25% of my time running the portfolio. It allowed me to raise capital, in a part-time entrepreneur mode. I would not have felt comfortable going out and raising venture money. So for multiple reasons, I think that was the right thing to do.
It's a great transition. As a GP, you probably only make money when your portfolio exits, right? That's where the majority of the money, the kicker is. That's why you build a portfolio over 10 years, so on. How does it work in a deal like this?
No, so Canon had an incentive system where partners' incentives were linked to the full partnership and not just to the deals that they did. Obviously, whether you made a partner or not dependent on the deals that you did. Right? So I had the fortune of being able to do that basis the investments we had done in India. And at the time that I left Canon, the investments that I had made were still not liquid, right? But thankfully, we were able to liquidate our investment holding as a whole, and thankfully, those companies have done very well after that. So one of the pleasures of selling something is that the person you are selling to should make money, right? And so that was a pleasure at Jobs Ahead because Monster continued to do very well with that platform for several years. And I think I feel happy that the people who bought our portfolio would have done well. Bharat Matrimony has gone public, Equitas has gone public, United Lex has sold profitably from where we sold that portfolio. So a lot of positive news. So the satisfaction of investing is not just in investing or not just in doing a secondary sale. It is in seeing those entrepreneurs succeed and build great companies.
The Canon investments was India's Web 1.0. Right? A lot of those funds. I mean, if you look at Bharat Matrimony, even today, sorry to say this, but probably still looks like Web 1.0. Uh, when was at Jabong, we had a competitor in Naptol uh, at
Yes.
some level.
Yeah.
Actually, what happened to Naptol? I think they became like a
So
TV channel. They did a few other things.
yeah. And that was my strategy. So what Naptol figured out is that the e-commerce space was getting too competitive and too capital intense, right? Whereas the TV commerce space
Hmm.
still held margins for them, right? So that was a deliberate direction that Manu and the board decided to take care to focus on television commerce. But clearly, the opportunity to do e-commerce was there. In fact, Manu's prior company uh, was a supplier of technology, the backend for many of the e-commerce portals.
Hmm.
Right. So he understood that well, but he did not think that you know uh, that business made sense.
Hmm.
This is the customer acquisition cost and how much burn would that have to incur.
Right.
And I think he was on the ball there. I think he was on the ball
I think there's a great opportunity. Like I love the fact that you could take your platform and then create videos and then
there.
drive it through cable networks
Yeah. Right.
and get uh, kind of like home shopping. But I think they
Yeah.
completely switched that model around.
Yeah. And so they
Today there's
started
so
off
many
with buying
competitors.
airtime. And then at some point, Manu came up to the board and said, having our own channel is meaningful. And I can
Mm.
tell you, I was not on the board of Naptol at that time. My partner
Mm.
was. But I can tell you there was nervousness of saying, are we going to run a TV channel now? Right? But they did a great job of, launching that, the kind of content you put, how do you generate the audience, what is the ad edit mix, if you will. So solid execution, guys. So I think, to your point, we did try some of the Web 2.0 kind of investments when we were at Canon. There was a license to do seed deals. So we did Tech Tribe, we did Chuckpuck, which were all trying to create the next generation of what online recruiting could look like or communities could look like. Uh, Unfortunately, we did not get much success with those companies. One of the things that I felt was, unlike the US market where disruption carried a lot of value in the internet space, the Indian startup space was still constrained by execution uh, bandwidth, right? It was not easy to hire talent from the industry in that period. And so I think we over time started to gravitate more and more towards backing great execution,
Mm.
right? So if you look at companies like United Lex, Naptol, we did Happiest Minds with Mr.
Yeah.
Ashok Chuta,
Mm.
uh, right? Those were all based around there is a solid opportunity, solid 10x opportunity, not a 100x necessarily, and we can feel confident about the execution skills. So I think more and more we started to support that piece. The car trade, Vinay, right? Great execution person. So yeah, it was less of we confined what we would call as highly disruptive plays to the seed business,
Mhm.
right? And so car trade was a seed investment, right?
Okay.
We started that with less than $1 million, pretty much alongside angels before micro VC was hot, and then we went on to continue to support them as they grew. So today, Cartrade will look like a late stage or a Series A investment, but we actually
Mm.
started on that as an angel investment.
Being an investor, a VC, did it help you build the muscle to be an angel as well? Do you require
You
different
know,
skills?
no, not really. I think a lot of skills are common. So what happened is after we started the Indian Angel Network, I was already doing some bit of angel investments, right? But through the course of Canon, and Canon permitted its personnel, to do angel investments on the side. Okay, that was allowed globally, right?
Okay.
But I did not want to do angel investments which potentially would have conflicts later. So in the US, the way we deal with it is if one partner has an angel investment and they come for an investment, then that partner is not involved. Other partners will take the decision. In India, I was the only partner, right? And so till 2014, till such time that I decided to exit Canon, Actually, my angel portfolio was fairly small. It might have been 10 companies or less. But it did give me a lot of understanding of what was I looking for, what was my thesis. Angel investment is slightly different because you're not dealing with other people's money, right? So you can be a bit more adventurous about it. So most of my angel portfolio actually has been built after I decided to exit here.
So you've been investing for over 15 years, actually now 25 years. Is that right?
No, investing 2005 to now. Yeah.
How many investments do you have at the moment?
So not counting the Canaan portfolio, I have done about 60 maybe. So, but this includes everything that I've done for the last 15 years. Some of those would be exited, some of those would be dead, some of those would be, you know, alive. I think I would really count about 2025 as in play right now.
Okay. Because I saw a list from last year and they mentioned Alok as one of the most prolific angel investors of 2019.
Yeah, that whatever, right? That's fine. That's not a badge of honor.
So that means you do about 4 to 6 deals a year.
Roughly that. Roughly that.
What do you do for deal flow? I think a lot of angel investors today, struggle with deal flow, right? And I think you have a fairly incredible portfolio from the last few years in terms of the entrepreneurs you meet, people who reach out to you.
So I was actually looking at what I do with that. So my portfolio has a mix of I think 3 buckets really. Right. One is people I know, and actually that part of the portfolio has done brilliantly for me. Right. So people I know before I invested in their company. Let me call it that. Right.
Could you expand on people you know? Because a lot of investors do say people I know, but there's very different layers of that.
Yeah. So these are largely people either who I have worked with. Right. So this will be my Jobs Ahead crew, right? Aricent crew, right? People of those sort. My alums, so IIT Delhi network. So and largely that, and then I would count my repeat entrepreneurs in their second avatar as people I know, right? So there'll be a few of those where I've backed. For at least 3 or 4 of my entrepreneurs, I've backed multiple companies now. The second pool is people who get referred in, right? So someone else is looking at the deal, they'll say, Alok, take a look. And so there are about 8-10 people, who I have co-invested with more than others, right? So I normally don't tend to follow, but if someone refers me someone, then I want to talk to them. I want to make sure I have conviction. That will be the second pool. The third pool will be what is coming through network. So as Indian Angel Network, or I participated with syndicates of a couple of friends where I have a pure follow role. So there'll be about 10-15% of my investments, which are, I have not done active diligence on those companies. And then there is the normal inbound, right? So those are the kind of 4 pockets. Since I have started IndyFi, I don't have a lot of time to go out and socialize and generate deals. Sure. So in that sense, networks tend to play a little bit more of a role. I probably don't have the time to process everything that comes inbound. And while that is somewhat unfair to the entrepreneurs, that is the constraint on time that I live with. So every plan that I get, I do go through it. I do respond to the entrepreneur. But there, one has to be fairly clinical to say, is this worth spending more time on? Whereas at Canaan, I was doing that for a day job. I would engage with a lot many more entrepreneurs.
As an investor, what have you really enjoyed working? What kind of entrepreneurs have you enjoyed working with? I mean, obviously, success is,
that's an outcome. Yeah, that's an outcome.
It's an outcome. That's right.
Yeah. So, I think what excites me is ideas and passion. And so entrepreneurs who exhibit that uh, can almost you know get my check on the power of that, right?
Mm,
So Akshay at Leverage Edu, yeah,
mm,
he's a energizer bunny, right? He's passionate about what he does. He's out there. He's bubbling with ideas. Right? So it's a lot of fun to do those. Uh, I like entrepreneurs who know what they want from me, right? So if they can be specific about what they are coming back to me for, that helps, right? Because as I said, I'm running my own company. I'm not going and asking these entrepreneurs for an information deck every month, every 3 months, right? So mostly, I tend to play a role of an available investor, not an active investor, not the passive investor. And so when the entrepreneurs are coming to me, typically they would come to me with saying, "This is the specific issue on which I need your help." They're not coming to me for everything, right? And normally, I'm not the only angel investor in these companies. So if entrepreneurs can triage what they're going to lean on who
mm,
for,
mm.
so I like that, right? And then when you do 60 investments, you encounter three entrepreneurs who just weren't the right people to back, right? And so those antennas have gotten sharper over time. Life is too short to deal with malintent, but unfortunately, you know that becomes 5% of the play. So I want to screen well for that, because it's just a waste of time to be in those companies.
What was the advice you gave to any of these entrepreneurs when COVID struck? When did you get a? I'm sure you sounded the alarm bell very early, at least to inform them, hey, this is happening. As an investor, you probably already have those instincts, saying this is what's going to happen, this is going to play out. When did you first hear about COVID in China, and how did you kind of react to it?
Yeah, I think the while the chatter had been there, uh, I think middle of February is really the first time when we started to understand that this is something that is going to have disruptive effect. So in Indifi, we started to prepare at that point in time, and with entrepreneurs that I was talking to, that is the point at which we started to interact. Now, since I don't take board positions and I am not the lead investor on record for most of these companies, uh, the approach I have followed is A, to be available to them, right, and B, align that advice to uh, what in my view is the middle path, right. So there is always this risk of polarization, right, of one saying hunker down, just survive for the next 12 months, and second instinct could be this thing is a 3-week lockdown, after that things will be fine, right. Normally I've seen that reality is in the middle and reality is contextual, right. So for example, if there's a company that is into the travel space and I had one investment in that space, the advice to that company is very, very different from the advice to an online gaming company, right. So it is contextual most of the time. Entrepreneurs know what their customers are telling them, right. So the second thing to be avoided in my mind is this top down notion of advice, right, a memo being sent to all 60 companies saying this is what you got to do, and the third important thing is that entrepreneurs have to remember that they still are in the business of value creation,
Mm,
right. No VC is going to look at a flat curve 12 months later and say, I'm going to fund you because you survived, right. That is not going to happen,
mm,
right. So entrepreneurs still have to find alternate pathways to saying, okay, what does now value creation mean? What
mm,
should I focus on in the next 6 to 12 months, right. They can't focus on just cost reduction, and that is true of me running my own business as much as advice I can offer to other people. So a lot of this advice has been I think the most important thing is to be available, right. Entrepreneurs need to talk, and then when you are available, getting entrepreneurs to articulate what they are seeing. Most entrepreneurs know, what they need to do. They just need more confidence in being able to do that. Right. So I think that is the best role I can play. I don't have a crystal ball to tell them where they're going.
How is this? I mean, of course, IndieFi is a debt financing platform, and debt has taken a huge hit in this last few months. How has it really affected your business and the entrepreneurs you work with as part of IndieFi?
Yeah. So, how it has affected us has been drawn out of how it has affected our entrepreneurs, right? So, the great thing is that of the investors that we have, 3 out of the 4 investors classify themselves as impact investors. We never designed that to happen. But one of the things that it brings to the discussions at the board is the customer empathy, right? So each of these investors, when they started calling us, and they started calling us maybe late March, early April, their question to us was, what is happening with your customers? Before they asked us what is happening with the company, right? And so a lot of what we are doing and how we are handling the scenario is based on what we are seeing happen with customers. So what we are seeing is in April timeframe, for example, most of our customers, right, and we operate largely in food delivery companies, retailers, e-commerce merchants. Most of them were shut for business, right? And so our response to that was, in line with that, right? We said we need to tone down the collections page, right? Because our customers are not in a position to pay. So for the customer's good, but also for our own good, right? You need to approach the customer with a degree of understanding. These are not people who are not paying because they don't want to pay. It is because their business is hampered, right? So one thing that we did was immediately, to whatever extent we collect, we brought down the tonality of that collection across the board. As soon as the RBI guidelines around the moratorium came up, right, we said anyone who needs the moratorium will get a moratorium. And so in April and May timeframe, for example, almost 2/3 of our customers opted for taking the moratorium. Right? We immediately diverted a large chunk of our salespeople to talking to customers in a non-sales, non-collections context. Right? So we designed surveys that we would run as continuous trackers. So we ran that in April, in May, in June. So we know what our customers are saying, what were they saying then, what are they saying now, which sectors are going through how much depression in revenue, when do they expect to come back up again, what help do they need to come back, right? So almost 20% of our sales capacity we diverted to just doing this, to listening to the customer and being able to react to that. For a lot of our customers, their cash flows get routed through us. So that provided us with incremental data to assess how their business is behaving, what is the depression. As of today, about 75% of our customers in food delivery and retail are operational back again. And roughly at 75 to 80% of the business turnover they were doing pre-COVID. In e-commerce, 100% of the people are back doing more than 100% of the business they were doing pre-COVID. Oh, wow. So now we can design our response, in line with this data, right? So the number of people who are taking the moratorium has gone down over the last couple of months. More collections is happening, and all that is because of the sensitivity that the board was able to bring to the table in addressing this issue. Now, having said that, existing portfolio will be under stress, right? So what we have done is to calibrate what stress will come because of intent issues, what will come because of ability issues. Again, go very, very segmented, bottom up on how do you deal with these customers, rather than saying, guys, go out and collect hard, right? The second thing that we started to see then is, the cost side of the equation. So we had to take steps on the cost side, both on operating costs and people costs. There were salary cuts that we had to do across the board, above a certain level of salaries, things of that nature. All this got done, or the design got done by end of April, early May. Right? And then we said, what is the future, right? The same thing. 12 months later, someone is not going to invest in us because Alok Mittal did a great job of cost cutting. Right? So last quarter, what we did was invest heavily in technology. We should do that all the time, but we built more technology last quarter than we did in the last 1 year. And this quarter, we are beginning to execute on strategic uh, uh, levers that we think represent the future of lending. Right. Some of those we were already working on, but we are intensifying. But some of those are new initiatives because we think that COVID will have a lasting impact on the lending industry. So, orientation towards balance sheet, orientation towards customer engagement, right? Those are some of the things that we are reinforcing in our business because we think that is what the next 4 or 5 years will represent. So that has been kind of the 2 or 3 phases, right? Understanding customers, building around them, costs, technology and product investments, and then refining our strategy. So I would divide kind of most of the things we've done over the last 4 or 5 months into those buckets.
What is your outlook for lending going forward? Because I know a lot of lenders had paused to making any new commitments.
Yeah. So we did the same. So in April, we did pretty much no new commitments, right? And I think the quality of data that we are able to lend on is slightly better than what the ecosystem generally does. So May we started to crawl. Our own view is that we will get back to pre-COVID levels by Jan, Feb, March time. Right now, that we could change. It could change on the positive side. It could change on the negative side, depending on how the situation evolves. But this is time for caution for all lending businesses. But I think it is also time for redesign. So we have come up with product constructs that actually add more value to the customer and are lower risk for us. We have started to see better quality customers walk in the door post-COVID, right? Because pre-COVID, we were competing with many more people than we are competing with now. So the quality of origination actually has gone up. So I think there are signals we are getting that the quality of business that we'll end up doing in this environment and even sustain after this is over may actually be better than what we were doing till February. And that is what we need to build ourselves for.
Is it because the pandemic gave you different data points to make better decisions, or there was some other reason for that?
No, so one thing it did is it reoriented us from focusing on just growth, right? So then the reality is that we have a core product that works, right? And when that happens, then you want to keep driving the organization towards growth, right? So we were going down that path, right? And when the reset button got hit, we said, okay, we have time to sit back and say, are we building the right product portfolio, right? Or can we reorient to better quality of customers? So those questions became more prominent. More management bandwidth started to go towards those questions. Maybe we should have done that before the pandemic hit us, right? But that is one set of issues. The second set of issues is what is happening in the environment, right? Because so few lenders are lending, right? People are coming to us for better creditworthy people are coming to us for their credit needs, right? And we are thinking about, I just don't want to do this for the next 3 months till other people start lending. How do I start to build in hooks that allow me to retain this, better population after the pandemic is over? So we have done some product initiatives purely to make sure customer engagement is high, right? And you've been in a payment business, so think payment style customer engagement, not lending style customer engagement. So those opportunities have come up because of the pandemic. So it's a mix of the two that is leading us to hopefully a better quality business as we come out of this.
A lot is being talked about GST and how it's impacted the segment that you're working with, SMEs.
Yeah.
Has it really helped in the lending business?
GST for the lending business so far is one in that chain of increasing formalization, and to that extent it helps, right? You can see more transactions in a formal manner, and hence without having a large feet on street, without having to go eyeball the customer, you can make better decisions, right? But I think the disruptive effect of GST is yet to come. So last year there was a report under chairmanship of Mr. UK Sinha, right, which talked about some of the things that can be done using GST, and if GSTN started to see itself not just as a tax filing system, right, but as an invoicing system. And some of those things are being put into practice now. So I do think that GSTN is transformative to working capital, but the transformative effect still has to show up. What we have seen so far is what I would call relatively incremental effect as one of the contributors to the formalization.
So you're saying that there are a lot more opportunities yet to come out of GST, which is
Absolutely.
And are you seeing a lot more startups going to take advantage of this?
Actually, no, not in the lending domain. I would love to see more GSTN-centric startups. And maybe once the infrastructure is in place, they will start to come in play, right? So the reality is that some of the stuff needs to get done at GSTN for these opportunities to fructify. And so a lot of existing players like us are saying, let's build for that. And in some sense, we have an advantage of being able to build preemptively. We've been building for that for a year now, right? Because initially the narrative was that this will come into play in January. We were building for January, now it's October, right? But I would expect to see many more, and not just in lending. We are seeing applications of that outside of lending. So I would think that there should be an entrepreneurial surge around GST and around account aggregators. That's the other piece of infrastructure that will come into play in the next 3 to 6 months. So those put together, I think do allow a lot of innovation to happen.
Look, this has been amazing. We spent quite a bit of time talking about investing and parts of IndieFi. We'll come back to it at some point. Are you hiring? Is it is the market bounce back? Are you looking to bring on people?
So yes and no. Market has not bounced back where we are at the levels that we were at in February, right? So from a direct headcount standpoint, sales, operations, we continue to be overstaffed at this point in time. But from a capability building standpoint, those are the positions. So very few positions, but specialized positions. More in the indirect cost structure. Those are positions that we continue to hire for.
So I'd imagine data and engineering.
So data, we have hired people. So in fact, this month, 3 more data scientists. Partnership management, product development. As I mentioned, there are a couple of new strategic levers that we are running behind. So the product people for those. So those are some of the positions that we've been hiring for.
Alok, thanks. This has been amazing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation, and especially coming at a Saturday morning at the leisure at my home. I think some of the upsides of working from home. Yeah. Thank you so much, Varun.
Thanks, Alok. Hey guys, if you want to hear from more amazing entrepreneurs like Alok, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned.